That's a live look at the Senate floor right now, where the vote has just been taken after a bipartisan compromise where the senators have agreed to allow the government to reopen until February 8th, 3 more weeks, in return for a commitment to get a vote on that bill to protect the Dreamers. So it's 800,000 young people who were brought into the country as undocumented immigrants. That demand by Democrats that there be some kind of a vote on DACA tied to the government funding has been what held up the government funding over these last 3 days. But now a bipartisan agreement has been reached to secure a vote sometime in February. I want to go to our senior congressional correspondent, Mary Bruce, for more on this. And Mary, what you saw here is really the old-fashioned Senate, Republicans and Democrats in the middle coming together to force the hands of their leaders.
Yeah, George, it does appear that compromise is alive and well here in Washington after all. There has been a frantic series of negotiations here over the weekend up to this morning. This went really down to the wire here. But as you mentioned, they were able to come together around this deal that in exchange for agreeing to fund the government temporarily for these next 3 weeks, Leader McConnell, the Republican leader of the Senate, made a commitment that he would take up and act on immigration legislation to address these Dreamers. And I'm told what really pushed it over the line for Democrats is that he agreed that if they can't reach an agreement by February 8th, he then made a commitment that he would immediately take up some kind of legislation to address DACA and the Dreamers. But, George, this all comes down to a commitment by Mitch McConnell. So Democrats here are essentially taking him at his word, which could be a bit of a risk. But Democrats that we have talked to in the last hour as this has been coming together essentially told us they thought this was going to be as good as it was going to get. In fact, one senator using the words of the Rolling Stones to explain you can't always get what you want, but if you try sometimes you just might find, George, you get what you need.
And one thing they didn't get, Mary Bruce, is any commitment to see the same kind of consideration in the House.
Yeah, that's still the big question here. What comes next in the House? Now, Paul Ryan has said that he would take up a vote on this temporary funding deal, but will they make the same commitment to act on Dreamers going forward? That remains a big question. And, of course, what will the president do next as well?
Well, I want to go to our senior White House correspondent, Cecilia Vega, for more on that. The president taking some heat from Senator Schumer as he announced this agreement, saying the president was largely absent from these negotiations. The Democrats never knew where he stood on the negotiations over the immigration bill, and this was worked out in the Senate in these final hours. But the White House can claim credit for not backing down to that Democratic demand that any consideration of DACA, that any passage of DACA be tied to government funding.
Yeah, and that was certainly our reporting here, George, that the White House is going to stand firm on that and not budge. They really felt like the Democrats were going to cave and come under fire. And really, that's what many of the Democrats are facing right now. A lot of the initial reaction coming in is that people are saying Democrats caved and they surrender. The president will probably take a victory lap. I wouldn't be surprised if we hear from him soon here at the White House. But I've got to tell you, much of the narrative coming out of these negotiations over the last 3 and 4 days is exactly what Chuck Schumer just said right there on the Senate floor, that the president, he called him the great deal maker, great deal making president, but he hadn't actually spoken to him since last Friday. And we do know from sources here at the White House that while the president spent many of the last few days of this weekend in the Oval Office on the phone, he didn't actually call any Democrats. So, this will certainly be the narrative going forward. Did he sit on the sidelines too much? Can he really take the credit for the results that we are seeing today? We will see.
And can they actually get to an agreement on the overall immigration issues between now and February 8th? Will we be right back in the same situation 3 weeks from now? You can get the latest news anytime by downloading the ABC News app. Also, there will be a special edition of World News Tonight with David Muir in Washington tonight. I'll see you tomorrow on GMA.
This has been a special report from ABC News.
Hey everyone, Amna Nawaz here, continuing coverage now. You just saw live there members of the Senate, both Republicans and Democrats, voting after 3 days to end the government shutdown. What does that mean moving forward? What exactly was cut behind the scenes here? What kind of deal? Let's bring in Rick Klein, ABC's political director down in Washington, D.C. So Rick, what exactly unfolded over the last 3 days? Did the Democrats cave, or was this actually a good deal for them?
I got an email from one Democratic operative off of the Hill who says that Chuck Schumer had a bad hand, and he started to realize it and decided to fold before it got too much worse for Democrats. I think that's going to be the prevailing view on this, is that Democrats didn't love the way this was playing. They weren't sure what the end game would be. They were frustrated, clearly, in not getting the president to the negotiating table. They didn't want to see this linger only over the immigration issue. So instead, they extracted a promise, although potentially a vague one, from the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell to take up immigration reform shortly after the spending deal is in place. And it will set off a wild 17 days of debate in the United States Senate that will be capped by votes at some point in the next couple of weeks that tackle all of these thorny issues of immigration potentially at the same time.
Let's go over now to our senior congressional correspondent, Mary Bruce, who's been tracking these ups and downs over the last 3 days. And Mary, it looks like we've bought ourselves a little bit of a reprieve now, right? They have until February 8th. But what exactly was agreed to, and what does it mean for the future of those dreamers?
Yeah, this was a compromise, a word we don't often hear here in these halls these days. Look, bottom line here is that in exchange for agreeing to reopen the government, to temporarily fund the government just for the next 3 weeks, Leader Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader, made a commitment essentially to act on immigration, to act on protections for dreamers, for those nearly 800,000 undocumented immigrants brought to the U.S. as children who have been at the center of this whole debate. Now, I'm told what really pushed this over the edge for Democrats was also a promise that if this doesn't get done by February 8th, if those 3 weeks aren't enough, that Mitch McConnell will then move immediately to consider some kind of DACA legislation. That essentially frees the path for, or opens the path for a bipartisan deal to try and address dreamers. We know there have been a lot of talks about this going on, but there hasn't been any real progress on the floor in that sense. So this opens up the door for that. But at the end of the day, it means that Democrats are taking Mitch McConnell's word. He is promising that he will do something. They feel confident in that promise, but that's not a guarantee, shall we say. But Democrats that we've talked to in the last hours, this has come together, have all said that they feel confident that this was as good as it was going to get. Remember, at the end of the day, they do all agree on the big principles here. No, neither Democrats nor Republicans want the government to stay shut down. They both want to do something to protect dreamers. They both want to come together, fund the government, do something to extend the children's health insurance program, which is part of this deal as well. It was just a matter of how to do it. And now Democrats feel they have at least satisfied their demands to get a commitment to protect dreamers as some part of a funding deal. But now it's time to spin, guys. Now you're going to see how both sides are playing this. The blame game, as you saw there in the speeches on the floor from both Schumer and McConnell, the blame game is still well underway, and I suspect you'll probably hear from the president as well as he tries to spin this to his advantage too.
Speaking of, let's head over to the White House now, thanks to Mary Bruce on the Hill. Cecilia Vega, our senior White House correspondent. Cecilia, what exactly is happening inside the White House? This is supposed to be the deal maker in chief. He's been tweeting against senior members of his own party in the last couple of days too. Where was the president over the last 3 days?
Yeah, the art of the deal, and it got really ugly, not only against members of his own party, but let's just quickly look back at that. Remember that political ad that the president's re-election campaign put out just a couple of days ago, basically accusing the Democrats of murder, of being responsible for murder if anybody dies over this debate about illegal immigration and a government shutdown. You heard Chuck Schumer there on the Senate floor not too long ago say that this, quote, great deal-making president hadn't actually spoken to him since Friday. And our sources have confirmed to us that the president did spend a number of hours making phone calls to allies and in his own party and to aides in his own staff, but he did not actually pick up the phone and call any Democrats. I don't think that will stop this White House from spinning this as a victory of this administration, as the art of the deal that Donald Trump does and they will say does well. But certainly there are questions about whether the president was too much on the sidelines during this, that because many of his aides feared that he could upend this deal, these negotiations that were happening over the last few days and basically, go rogue as he has been prone to do. So certainly this narrative is not over. I would not be surprised, as Mary said, that we might hear from the president at some point here at the White House today.
Cecilia Vega live there for us at the White House. Rick Klein down in D.C. One of the things I wanted to ask you about, Rick, Mitch McConnell there said as he took the floor that the strategy to shut down the government over illegal immigration is something the American people don't understand. I think a lot of people would co-sign to that. I don't think a lot of people understand how DACA ended up at the heart of this whole debate. It's something that seems to have bipartisan support in terms of being able to move forward. It's something the majority of American people would like to see solved soon. How did we end up here?
So I've covered an embarrassing number of shutdowns in a relatively short amount of time in Washington. Embarrassing maybe for Washington and maybe for me and my age. But I will say, even in that context, this shutdown made no sense. the things that they were arguing about, things like chip funding, things like status for the so-called Dreamers under DACA, things like military funding, they actually didn't disagree on them. It's not like 2013 when Republicans shut down the government in an effort to defund Obamacare. These were not about sharply partisan political differences. It was about positioning. It was about tactics. And a lot of the messaging got lost along the way. A lot of it rests at the feet of the president, who meandered and his, I think, erratic policy behavior. He contradicted himself over the last couple of weeks. He poisoned the well with that now famous S-hole comment in the Oval Office a couple of weeks ago. But from the Democratic perspective, they were not having an effective time in communicating what this was about. It made a number of their Senate Democrats uncomfortable, particularly those who live in red states and are up for re-election at the end of the year. They don't want to be seen as shutting down the government over this. And I think they were having a hard time explaining how it was wrapped together, particularly because the deadline to figure out a DACA solution is still about 6 weeks away. This now guarantees that you're going to have some votes, including on DACA, including taking care of the Dreamers, in the next few weeks. And I think that's where Democrats made this play. But you're right, they were not able to explain what this was about. Fundamentally, it wasn't about that much, and I think that was their problem from the beginning.
And Rick, so just in terms of how we move forward, what it means for both sides. Now, neither side looks really good coming out of this, but there are some new numbers from an ABC News Washington Post poll I wanted to ask you about. People were asked, and I should note this question went out before the shutdown went into effect, basically who they would blame if the government were to shut down. And most of the blame seemed to fall with congressional Republicans and this administration. Does that give Democrats any more leverage in negotiations moving forward?
Well, I think no one wants to see a government shutdown, and I think if you're going to start to parcel out blame, the party that actually controls the White House and both houses of Congress is going to take a major chunk of that. The president can only separate himself from so much, not to mention his own behavior during this time and his commentary and his tweets and his own campaign ad that I don't think was helpful at all to the negotiations over the weekend. I don't think either side wants to do this again. That doesn't mean it won't happen all over again. That's the leverage, though, that is brought to bear. I think Democrats do feel like if the shutdown is done under the right circumstances, there are principles that are worth going to the mat over, and they would gladly fight that out on that terrain. They weren't there quite yet, and I don't think this was the kind of shutdown that had a lot of deliberate planning that went into it with the Democrats marshaling their votes. Clearly, they had their own members who were uncomfortable by this. This deal, if that's what you want to call it, to reopen the government, has a lot on the left upset. They're saying, what did we actually get for this? Why did we go through the last 72 hours to not even have any kind of ironclad guarantees, much less any policy advancement? We were really back to the same pitched battle just a couple of weeks off.
So it's a deal with a little d for sure. But then look forward for me now, right? They've got 17 days to try to get something together. Are we just going to end up right back here on February 8th?
I think that you have to look at that as a distinct possibility. You know, Mary Bruce asked a great question, I think, on Capitol Hill earlier. She was running around talking to senators, and she said, isn't this really all about trust? And she was asking Senator Flake about the trust in Mitch McConnell to bring something up. And I feel like trust is so lacking right here because all of this deal, little d or big D, is based on knowing that the other side is able to come through. And when I look at the landscape right now, look, Democrats don't trust Republicans and Republicans don't trust Democrats. It's not just that, though. House Republicans don't trust Senate Republicans and vice versa. Inside their own conference, House leadership Republicans don't necessarily trust their own Freedom Caucus people. That has nothing to do with President Trump, whom nobody trusts to really stay true to his word because his word has changed so much. So I see a lot of pitfalls over these next 17 days, plus the history of immigration. You can go back to Ronald Reagan, but even in more recent times, George W. Bush wanted to make comprehensive immigration reform a hallmark of his time in office. He was unable to do it even with Republican control. When the Democrats had control of Congress, they couldn't do it. When it was Democrat and Republican control, Democratic White House, Republican control of Congress, they couldn't do it. Now it's all Republicans in control. So the idea that they're going to be able to, in the next 17 days, work out all of these thorny issues, bring them to conclusion, take care of DACA and the Dreamers, take care of things like chain migration, take care of things like legal immigration, and take care, of course, of that big, beautiful border wall that the president wants. Count me as a skeptic.
All right, not a terribly inspiring note there from Rick Klein. But if you can somehow sort of map out that mistrust in like a Venn diagram or something, that would be super helpful. I will watch your Twitter feed.
I'll work on that. It's a lot of zigzags and a crisscross with the president sitting above all of it, kind of shrugging about how you get from point A to point B.
I'll look out for it. ABC's political director Rick Klein. Thanks, man. Good to talk to you.
Thanks, Amna.
Thanks to all of you for watching as well. Head over to abcnews.com anytime. Get the latest on all of these stories, or download the ABC News app. Get all the breaking news right to your phone. For now, I'm Amna Nawaz, and I'll see you back here soon.